All right, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and I want to commence my discussion with you folks by thanking Judyth Baker for inviting me and for complimenting and commending Judyth for having organized such a wonderful conference, bringing together all of you people from so many different walks of life. Judyth has done a tremendous job. I have enjoyed corresponding with her in the preceding months, and I'm delighted to be here with you. I did an hour-and-a-half interview just a little bit earlier today at the museum, and I hadn't been to the museum in many years. I was a little surprised at the huge audiences in and out, and then outside on the street, and of course my old dear friend Bob Groden was there. This is between arrests for Bob. We're fortunate to have him out of jail at this time. And I made a lot of points that I want to share with you folks today. You guys are into this case, and this is quite different from what I encountered. Of course, I've been invited to talk about JFK numerous times during the course of the year, the most recent of which was last night. 250 people at an adjacent county to ours, Allegheny County, Pittsburgh. And it was a wonderful fundraising event for an educational organization. And I talked about my cases, but mostly JFK. And it is fascinating to know, and I want you to be aware of this. And yes, I think I am articulate. I think that I present an interesting case from a forensic scientific standpoint. But the point I want to make with you all is that the public is out there, and they have to be constantly reminded about what this is, about what it was, and what we have to do. And to that point, by the way, and I shall not take any more time from my limited time here with you to refer you to our new organization, CAPA, Citizens Against Political Assassination. We invite all of you to join, to become active members. And while we shall be talking about, as the acronym name indicates, political assassinations, we're focusing right now heavily on the 1992 Congressional Act, which calls for the release of all of the JFK materials in October 2017, 25 years after that 1992 Act. And we're going to be pushing hard for this, and we need everybody on board. So let's start and talk about this case. You all know the background, of course, and I don't have all the time, and it's not necessary to go into this with you folks. You're JFK assassination veterans. You remember what was going on. And it's good to be reminded when you talk to people, in order to set the stage, to present the scenario, just as if you were going to present a play, to remind people, and for many younger people, to tell them something they did not know, and which they will not find in the history books. And that is the ugliness that existed in this city prior to JFK coming, when Adlai Stevenson, twice presidential nominee, UN ambassador, was spat upon and jostled in the streets of Dallas just a couple of weeks before. And the largest downtown newspaper accepting and publishing a full-page ad with a black rim border suggesting nothing less than an obituary notice, and tens of thousands of handbills wanted for treason in John Kennedy's picture there. And school children, when notified that their president had been killed throughout the South, burst out into applause. Know that, and remind people that tell you that they believe in the Warren Commission and how could this have happened. You need to set the stage and talk about what was going on nationally, civil rights and human rights. Talk about the Bay of Pigs, talk about Vietnam, talk about the CIA's role in overthrowing our Benz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, any damn thing, the brothers in Vietnam, anything that the CIA wanted to do, they were going to do. And John Kennedy's answer to that was, as he tore up a piece of paper and threw it into the air in the presence of Senator Mike Mansfield, "This is what I intend to do to the CIA." Keep that in mind. And know the ugliness then that existed. So they came and they started, and it was wonderful. It was much better than anybody had expected. As it turned out, the weather was clearing, the sun was shining, the flags were flying, the crowds were cheering. It was going to be a beautiful day. They loved Jackie Kennedy. And they came down Main Street, as you all know, and then made that turn on the Houston and then the left turn onto Elm Street, taking full advantage, as a politician would do, of a crowd. And there's the picture. You've probably seen this many times here today and yesterday by presenters. I don't have to go over this with you. You're all aware of it. By the way, I walked with my good friend Andrew Craig back there today on that picket fence area and looked at it, and just to remind yourself in a very physical sense of what that setup was. There you see that southeast corner window, and here, by the way, you've seen this as a Zapruder film, just these few seconds, and just keep your eye as they come out from behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. Frame 313, that horrible, horrible moment. And here it is again in slow motion. I want you to look at the positions of JFK and Connally. Watch when they come out. Watch where Connally's hat is located. You see the way Kennedy's body moves violently backward and to the left. A motorcycle riding behind the left rear wheel for several seconds was convinced that he had been shot as blood, brain, bone, and tissue landed on him behind the left rear wheel, with the body moving backward and to the left. And you got to know this and deal with it and be prepared and learn about Nobel Prize winner Alvarez's experiment shooting cantaloupes or melons on the top of a fence, leaving out how they all fell, and the bullshit about equating a melon with somebody's head in a dynamic physical process. Notice the positions, 30 inches separating John Kennedy's chest from Connally's rear. Going in, coming out. There's Connally. Look where that hat is. Look where that hat is. At this point, as you look at Kennedy, his arms up to his mouth and throat, the bullet obviously having struck him. Look at John Connally. Under the single bullet theory, John Connally has had a bullet rip through his chest, perforate the lung, destroy 4 inches of the right fifth rib, exit from his anterior chest, re-enter the dorsal surface of the right wrist, shatter the distal end of the radius, a bone coming down from the elbow to the wrist, which broadens just before it meets the small 8 bones of the wrist, shatters that bone, exits from the front of the wrist, and re-enters the governor's left thigh. Let's talk about that bullet. Let's talk about the gunshot wounds of John Kennedy. At Parkland Hospital, and this is so important, some 18 physicians in a period of minutes were all in that ER working on him. And among them was the chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery right here at Baylor, and right here in Dallas, Kemp Clark, a prominent neurosurgeon. And with him was an assistant, Robert Grossman, who went on to become chief of neurosurgery at Baylor, where one of my sons had trained in neurosurgery some years later. These 18 physicians, including 2 neurosurgeons, think about how many brains they had operated upon. Think of what they knew about the anatomy of the skull, of the craniocerebral makeup. All of them identified fractures of the calvarium in the occipital area. That's the back of your skull. This is frontal forehead. These are temporal around the ears. This is occipital in the back, and everything on the top is parietal. They identified fractures of the calvarium in the occipital area, right occiput. And they identified extensive hemorrhagic lacerations and destruction of a large portion of the cerebellum. The cerebellum is that part of the brain which is located in the inferior posterior part of your cranial vault. Deals with balance and coordination. Back here, back here. That's what they identified. And they saw then 2 gunshot wounds, a big gaping defect on the head, and a gunshot wound in the front of the neck at the anterior midline of the neck. The body, in violation of the laws of Dallas and the state of Texas, was forcibly removed from the hospital and flown to Washington, D.C. The medical examiner, whom I knew from my days in the Air Force, we attended the same conferences at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. Earl Rose was literally pushed up against the wall. Hands on guns, profanity and threats as they moved the body of the president away. Now here's the irony. That action, as horrific as it was, should have played to their benefit. It gave them 7 hours to get their act together. It gave them vital time to call upon the foremost forensic pathologists in the country to do this autopsy. Milton Helper, chief medical examiner of New York City, was packing his bag. This is, I have this from Milton. He had already called some people to join him, one of whom was Russell Fisher, under whom I trained in forensic pathology when I got out of the Air Force. Certain he was, not arrogantly, but, you know, what do you expect? The president has been shot and killed. We've got a difficult situation. We have multiple gunshot wounds to deal with. We've got to determine angle, trajectory, sequence, and we've got to correlate these wounds with John Connally's wounds. That's a formidable task. Man, I'll tell you, that could be hours and hours by competent forensic pathologists working as a team. So who did our government call upon? And I want you to think about this. I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. It doesn't make any goddamn difference. This is our President of the United States of America. All the time in the world to get the act together, to speak with the doctors at Parkland. What did you see? What did you do? When I was coroner, anytime somebody had been shot or stabbed and operated upon, you always wanted to talk with the surgeons, because surgeons will invariably, understandably, go through that opening of the gunshot wound, the stab wound, to get to the seat of the hemorrhage, of the bleeding, of the damage to tissues. All that time. They never called anybody. They never spoke with the doctors in Dallas. And who was called upon to do this autopsy on our president? Humes and Boswell, 2 career military pathologists who had never done a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. And when you speak to people who tell you that we buy the Warren Commission, you do what I did last night with my audience and what I've done 1,000 times. And you let them know what their evidentiary burden is as they assume that defense of the Warren Commission. Let them know that the 2 guys that did that autopsy had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. I often say, just think analogously in a hypothetical fashion. Let's say the president had slipped that day and struck his head on the bathroom floor and had suffered a concussion, was a little dazed. And I would ask you, non-medical people, what kind of specialist would you call in to evaluate him? Neurosurgeon, neurologist, internist, we want to check his cardiac and respiratory status. If you know a little about medicine, you say an ophthalmologist. We'll look at the eye grounds, because sometimes there's a manifestation of intracranial hemorrhage seen in the eye grounds. Okay, what if under my hypothetical, with Kennedy having suffered a concussion, they would have called in a dermatologist, an obstetrician, and a plastic surgeon? What do you think about that, huh? Okay, that's what they did here. Yeah, now Pierre Fink came over just to make sure the story is correct and full. And I knew Pierre Fink. I didn't know the other guys. I knew Pierre Fink from my Air Force days. He came there about an hour late, an Army man, and Pierre tried to raise some questions and was told to just proceed, doctor. We'll tell you what to do. And I spoke with Pierre Fink sometime later at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, where I gave my paper in February 1965 following the release of the Warren Commission report. And he was so sad, so forlorn, could not even speak about this case. And it wasn't too long after that that this Swiss national, with a prominent position here, and very comfortable and happy in his professional career, left for Switzerland and has been essentially incommunicado since that time. What did these doctors do at Dallas? Excuse me, at Bethesda? at Bethesda. I told you what they saw in Dallas. In Bethesda, they claimed a smaller hole in the back of the skull and a separate large tangential avulsion of cranial bone and brain on the right parietal, that's the side area. And then they found a bullet wound in the back, 5.5, 6 inches below the crest of the shoulder. They probed with their finger, felt nothing. Probed with a metallic probe, felt nothing. Took x-rays, saw nothing. Opened up the body, did the autopsy, removed the lungs, and found nothing. Can you imagine? They must have really been staining their underwear at that point with 33 people in the autopsy room, including 4-star admirals and generals, and they got a bullet hole, and they can't find the bullet to go with it. Just then information comes in from the FBI in Dallas, transmitted to the FBI up there, that a maintenance man trying to get to the men's room because he had to urinate, moving stretchers that were blocking his way by the ER. Lo and behold, there was a bullet. Nobody had seen this bullet before. 6.5 millimeter copper jacketed lead core, 1¼ inch in length, 1/4 inch in diameter. There it was, lying there. Ah, said the doctors doing the autopsy, these two comedians, we know what happened. When the president lay on his back and the doctors applied pressure for cardiac massage anteriorly, they forced the bullet back out through the same channel. It doesn't work that way. When the bullet goes into your body, it produces hemorrhage. The tissues swell, they engorge. The soft tissues encase the bullet. Sometimes they'll spend hours looking for and digging out a bullet. But this was their conclusion. It wasn't until the next morning that they learned about a bullet hole in the front of the president's neck. Now let me ask you something. Do you think you have to go 4 years of college, 4 years in med school, and 6 years in pathology to become a forensic pathologist before you look at the person sitting next to you and see a gaping, hemorrhagic, bleeding hole in the front of his neck? What do you think? You want to spend 14 years to learn how to do that? Well, how in the hell did they miss it? Because they were looking at a tracheostomy. You've visited people in the hospital for one reason or another. When the brain is not working, you make an incision in the trachea. The doctors at Parkland had quickly ascertained that the bullet had ripped through the trachea, and they had the tracheostomy in place. But the opening, the hole, was not big enough to attach the cuff from the respirator machine. So they enlarged upon it, not deceitfully, not malevolently, but they did the right thing. And these guys never knew until the next morning, after they had given their report to Hoover and Johnson, that there was a bullet hole in the front of the neck. How do you handle that? You're a career military person, you're a pathologist. What would you do under that situation? Well, I'll tell you. If you're Asian, you commit suicide. If you're European, you resign. If you're American, you just bullshit your way out of it. And that's exactly what they have. Now, I just want you to take a good look. Look at where Connolly's hat is being held, okay? Look at his hand. So these people that recreate, I was asked in a nice way by Steve Fagan at the museum, what about so-and-so's pictorial representation and diagram of how it could have been possible for this bullet to have done all of these things. And I said, go back to the Zapruder film and look. And look, there it is. There is the hand, there is the white Stetson. What level is it? Is it at neck level? Okay? Well, the bullet that came out of John Connolly under the single bullet theory exited below nipple level. I won't take the time here. I always get two people up and sit them on a stage and then show the trajectory of this bullet. This was what they were stuck with. This was their problem. Look, there it is. Look at John Connolly. A hell of a man. I'm sorry I didn't vote for him for president. A guy could be shot 4 times, 5 times, right? In and out of the chest, in and out of the wrist, into the left thigh. This is the goddamn guy we need. He makes Trump look like a sissy. Okay. Oh, you can't hear me? Okay. All right. Okay. I'll keep it up. There's Kennedy. Now I want you to look. There's 313. Now look at the ensuing frames of Zapruder film. Look at the direction the body moves. Backward, 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 backward. Okay? Okay. Here's the diagram of the president's wounds. on the right side, you see the wound in the back, and then you see up in the head where they put in a defect, and that's what they diagrammed for Kennedy. And there's the famous shot with the tracheostomy measurement. And here's Connolly's wounds, like I told you. So they have the entrance in the right posterior axillary area, which in simple non-medical terms means just behind your right armpit. They have the exit below the nipple level. There you see it on the figure on the left. And you see re-entrance back to the figure on the right, and then re-exit on the figure on the left from the anterior aspect of the wrist, and then you see the re-entrance into the left thigh. So what is the history of the magic bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, the hero of Arlen Specter's single bullet theory? To recapitulate, because you've been here all day, you're a little groggy by now, so I want to refresh your memories. On Friday night when they did the autopsy, where was the bullet from? Kennedy's back. The next day when they learned about the wound in the front of the neck, where was that stretcher bullet from? Kennedy's neck. Saw the starched white collar, got scared to death, and just plopped in front of his clothing. 5 months later, that bullet has been re-energized, revitalized, and it has now gone through Connolly's chest, through Connolly's wrist, into his left thigh, and it plopped out spontaneously out of his left thigh. That is the history of Commission Exhibit 399, Arlen Specter's single bullet theory, what Mark Lane and I and others long ago dubbed the magic bullet theory. Arlen Specter, junior legal counsel at that time, he came up with the idea, and got to give him credit for being imaginative, because they were stuck. They were really stuck. J. Edgar Hoover, on Monday, November 25, was already telling the world that the case was over. Hoover, he knew that Oswald was a sole assassin. If you have a murder in your respective communities, Kansas City, Minnesota, Maine, I don't give a damn where you're from, I guarantee you that the police are not going to tell you that the case is finally over until they have a chance to check everything out. And especially if you have a case in which you have not yet gotten information, either by confession or something of a direct physical, visual nature from the perpetrator. And yet, J. Edgar Hoover, in this case, with our president, killed in broad daylight in a major city, with all of this medical information to be evaluated, to be assessed, is announcing that Oswald, who is now dead, conveniently killed the day before by Jack Ruby. The Warren Commission said, oh, Jack Ruby, he just happened to be there with the crowd. He was down at the Western Union sending money to a former stripper, and they just walked in. I always tell people, see, you could have been there too. You could have been a moment in history had you been around the Dallas Public Safety Building. You two could have just walked down the driveway. Well, we've come to learn that that is pure nonsense, that he was let in by a high-ranking police official into the basement of the Dallas Public Safety Building, where Jack Ruby, who was mafia from the age of 17, Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago, was conveniently located. And according, of course, to Ruby, he just did it because he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain, the agony of going through a trial, of having to be present while Oswald was being tried. And that's why he, Ruby, decided to kill Oswald and obviate such emotional trauma down the line. So, this is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report. And you have to understand this when you're talking to people. They cannot have any deviation, any exception to this at all. You are pregnant or you are not pregnant. You can't be in between. If you don't have a single bullet theory, you've got two shooters. And that was their problem, and that remains their problem today. Many people in good faith, understandably, ask, hey, you know, what's the problem here? They get a second shooter. Fine. The problem is, the moment you have a second shooter, under the laws of every state and the union and the federal government, you're talking conspiracy. Use that word in a legal sense, conspiracy. And that opens up door one. And then door one opens up other doors, and on and on and on. And where does it end? That's why it was essential. That's why it is necessary, without any deviation whatsoever, that these people who continue to defend the Warren Commission have to stick with this because they have no opportunity to be the least bit flexible. And you've got to keep jamming that in their ears and in their face every time this question comes up. Look at this fragment. This is this is a metallic fragment that is removed from a bullet. I spoke with the chief. This is what happens. This is from Kennedy when a bullet strikes bone. I spoke with Audrey Bell, the chief OR nurse, and she told me that she was given by the surgeons who operated on John Connolly several pieces of metal that she turned over to the FBI. What we're told here is a fragment from Kennedy's case. This bullet, in its pristine condition, weighs 161 grains. As it was found, it weighed 158.6 grains. A loss of 2.4 grains, which is exactly 1.5% of its total original weight. And we are told that this bullet was deposited fragments in 3 anatomical locations, that the total quantity, the weight of those fragments, only measured 1.5% of the original weight of the bullet. The Warren Commission relied early on a paper that said that the fragment that was tested was uniquely, which means in the Merriam-Webster dictionary sense of that word, only to that particular bullet, they said. And that's been shown to be totally false. Won't get into this, but this is a marvelous paper by Dr. Randich and Dr. Grant talking about that. Now here's the trajectory. The bullet comes in to Kennedy. You saw the hole in the back. You saw their diagram. So to begin with, the bullet moves upward 11.5 degrees. How did my colleagues on the House Select Committee Forensic Pathology panel handle that? They said, well, what if Kennedy were bent over like this? Then it would. I said, sure. The only thing is, the Zapruder film does not show him tying his shoelace or scratching his groin. That's not what he was doing in Dallas that day, okay? Now the bullet exits. It's moving forward, it's moving leftward, and it's moving downward. Okay? Just picture. 2.5 feet between Kennedy and Connolly. Connolly right there. The bullet moving that way. The bullet comes over, 18 inches or so, turns, slams into Connolly behind the right armpit, exits from the front of his chest below nipple level. He's holding the Stetson hat. You saw it right here yourselves. The bullet comes out like this, and then sweeps up and around, slams into his right wrist, exits from the front of the right wrist, re-enters the left thigh, and conveniently falls out of the left thigh. I wish that when I do autopsies on homicides looking for bullets, that they would just pop out like that and make it goddamn easier for me. I have to dig around and waste my time. The blue line represents the way in which the bullet would have traveled. Bullets, despite the Warren Commission, notwithstanding the Warren Commission and its defenders, bullets move in straight lines. And the red dotted line gives you an idea of the artificial, totally impossible trajectory attributed to it by the Warren Commission. One more view of that Zapruder film. Take a look. Look at Connolly, look at Kennedy, watch him coming out of Stemmons. There it is. Now, here is the bullet. Here is the bullet. You're looking at the bullet in its transverse lie above. You're looking at the nose in the bottom left, and you're looking at the base in the bottom right. The deformity at the bottom right is from the impact of the firing mechanism. The nose, the cone of the bullet is completely intact. The missile itself is completely intact. A couple of small little markings are where the FBI took pieces of metal for testing. So this is a bullet that has produced 7 wounds in 2 men and broken 2 large bones. And remember, This is not one of the dainty young women we have in the audience here, 110, 120 pounds. You're talking about John Connolly, 6'4", big bone Texan. And 4 inches of the right fifth rib is destroyed, obliterated. And the radius, a big, dense, heavy bone, just where it comes in to meet the 8 small bones of the wrist, has been comminuted. Not a linear fracture, but a comminuted, which means a fragmented fracture. Look at that picture. Now, there was somebody on that warrant commission, I don't know who, somebody had some integrity. Somebody said, hey, can a bullet do that? Is it possible? And they conducted tests. If God came to me today, or some omnipotent power, and said, for whatever reason, you must give up and destroy every single thing you own on the JFK assassination, including letters, correspondence, memoranda, as well as papers and books and charts and diagrams, everything, and I mean everything, you're going to be able to keep one thing. One thing. This is what I keep. This is what I keep. And it's nothing that I created. They set up an experiment, which of course is what you're supposed to do when you're a forensic scientist in this kind of a situation involving bullets and guns. And they first shot into cotton wadding. We do that, either cotton wadding or a barrel of water. So you want to get the bullet with no damage to it from impacting against anything to see what it will look like having been shot from that gun. And then the second target was a goat. And they set up many different goats, repeating that experiment there, shooting to break one rib of the goat to simulate Connolly's rib fracture. And then the third target was a cadaver, and many cadavers, not just one. And they set that up to shoot through and break the radius. That was their experiment. This is what they selected. This is not a Wecht photograph. This is a photograph from the federal government, a Warren Commission exhibit. And so I love to say, when I speak to an audience, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you. I'm the prosecutor, prosecuting that horrible, evil man, the defendant Oswald, who killed our president. And I don't want to keep you. You've been patient here for 6-7 weeks. But I just want to recapitulate some of the highlights. My learned opponent, attorney so-and-so, has ridiculed the presentation of our forensic pathologist regarding the gunshot wounds. And he's called this single bullet theory. He's referred to it in a jocular fashion to ridicule it as the magic bullet theory. So I want to show you. I want to show you our evidence to remind you. If the bullets come in from the left, the two together, if the bullets that strike cotton wadding, hitting no dense object, can look like that. If the bullet second from the right, breaking one rib of a goat, looks like a different missile, is it? But no, that's his deformity from striking a rib of a goat. And a bullet at the far right that broke a radius in a cadaver can look like that. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, can there be any doubt, any hesitation on your part whatsoever that a bullet that breaks both a rib and a radius can look like Commission Exhibit 399, the far left? The far left is the hero of the Warren Commission report. That is the magic bullet. There you have it. This was their experiment. I participated with other people in reproducing these, and Dr. John Nickel, a pathologist in Kansas many years ago, he produced it. Everybody has gotten the same results. And of course the government will not reproduce this. They will not undertake, again, any kind of, because they can't. This is the 26-volume set. When I was contacted by the American Academy of President Program Chairman in late '64 and asked to represent the pathology section at the annual meeting in February '65 in discussing the Warren Commission report, which had come out in the fall of '64, I went to our Carnegie Library, and they already had the 26 volumes. And I want you to know, when you begin to think of how the government has handled this in such a deceitful, manipulative fashion. If it weren't so serious, it would be almost laughable. They put out these 26 volumes with no index. One woman, Sylvia Marr, M-E-A-G-H-E-R, excellent book, Accessories After the Fact. One woman, a single woman living in Manhattan, we became good friends, working at the UN, Sylvia Marr, and this is pre-computer days. She put together an index which is still used today. But the government could not find the competent individuals to make an index for 26 volumes. And that was just part and parcel of their continuing deceitful cover-up. Let me tell you, in 1972, when I was the first non-government forensic pathologist given access to the autopsy materials at the National Archives, there's a cockamamie agreement in April of '65 that they said was promulgated by Jacqueline Kennedy that gave full control and ownership of all the autopsy materials, including John Connery's clothing, and the x-rays, and the bullets, and the fragments, and the rifle. All of that belonged to Jacqueline Kennedy. Yeah, like she really wanted to have that in her home, right? You can just picture that. That's April of '65. October of '66, they go in and do an inventory. And guess what? Not only some radiographs, x-rays, not only some microscopic tissue slides, but the metal box, which contained the brain, as of April '65, was no longer there. And that was front page story with Fred Graham of the New York Times in August of '72, when I came out and he had an exclusive interview because he had helped me gain access to the New York Times, which is a long story. Let me tell you about the brain. You gotta understand this. I don't mean the least bit crude to be the least bit crude and insensitive, but there's no better analogy I can give you than this. A fresh brain has the viscosity, has the consistency of a well-done soft-boiled egg. And if you try to cut it, you can't do it. You can't cut a soft-boiled egg and have pieces that you can juxtapose one against the other. And so what you do in pathology, when you have a brain that needs to be examined, whether it's for brain tumor or other injuries, or specifically for gunshot wounds, you place it in formalin. That's the fixative solution. And it hardens in 2 weeks, and it assumes the consistency of a hard-boiled egg. And again, I repeat, I'm not trying to be the least bit flippant here, but just picture then the hard-boiled egg that you slice from one end to the other, from one side to the other, and you lay it out. That's the way you handle it. And that would show you the trajectory of the bullets that go through the brain. Look at the autopsy report. Read the autopsy report. And this is what it says when they went back 2 weeks later on December 7th. Coronal sections, that's side to side, coronal sections of the brain are not made in order to preserve the specimen. Preserve the specimen, right? They were going to give it to Jacqueline Kennedy to place on the mantelpiece so she could have it there to share with her kids and other family members in the years ahead, to preserve the specimen. To this day, and don't let anybody BS you on this, there has been no accounting for that at all. And people say, the Warren Commission people, that, well, the Kennedy family took it and they buried it and so on. You never heard that? Ask anybody to show you any memorandum, any statement, even one that suggests that no such thing exists. The Kennedys would certainly have had every right to do that as a matter of their religiosity, whatever. Nobody has ever made that statement. That brain was not examined, because if it had been examined, it would have shown that Kennedy was struck and a shot fired from behind the on the grassy knoll behind the picket. The bottom line, folks, is this, from a forensic pathology standpoint. Consider everything that I have shown and discussed with you. The movement of the body, the positions of the bodies of Kennedy and Connally prior to and during and immediately following the shooting. Consider the pictures that I have shown you involving the bullet and the bullet fragments. Keep all of that in mind. The bottom line here is that you have two shooters. There is no question in my mind that one is from the right side. That shooter was behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. The shot from the rear, arguably Texas School Book Depository, Deltex building, I think one of the two, and you can line up a trajectory from either one. I personally do not believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was a shooter. But what I say is, to the people that would argue, you want Oswald as a shooter? Here, take him as a shooter. My involvement in Kennedy now for these last 55 years is not based upon my desire to posthumously exonerate Lee Harvey Oswald. I really don't give a damn about Oswald in that sense. I mean, I care about justice. I certainly do. And the man was killed in a very unjust act. I care about that. But I mean, that's not my purpose. The purpose is to show that there were two shooters. And what that means, my friends, is that there was a plot, there was a conspiracy. And you think about what was going on in the world at that time with the CIA running the show and doing whatever they wanted to, the debacle of the Bay of Pigs, etc. They were looking at 5 more years, those people who, when the flags are flying and the Star-Spangled Banner is being sung, they hear and see things that you and I, just everyday American citizens, we don't hear and see. They understand that John Kennedy was taking America to hell in a handbasket. And they weren't going to sit around for 5 more years of John Kennedy, followed by 8 years of Bobby Kennedy. 13 years is a lifetime in the political evolution of a nation. A lifetime. This isn't like a hockey game, wait till the 3rd period, the basketball game, wait until the 2nd half, the baseball game, wait till we're at bat in the 9th inning. This is American politics, 13 years. And the only way to handle that, you can't beat the Kennedys at the polls. There's only one way to do that, and that is to execute him, to eliminate him physically. And everywhere in the world, when this has happened, except in America, it has been labeled for what it was, and this is what you must keep in mind and understand, and why all of us here continue to fight this battle and pursue the ultimate objective of disclosing the truth, that this was the overthrow of the government. This was coup d'etat in America. That's what the JFK assassination was all about. Thank you.